Hey everybody, this is going to be a quick lecture on intelligence theory and assessment. For those of you who have perhaps an AP review book or you're curious as to what specific unit this is in AP psychology, it's often referred to as testing individual differences. So if you come across that kind of phrase of a unit testing individual differences, basically it's a unit that looks at intelligence and how we try to define intelligence and really how we try to assess it. Um, in general, intelligence essentially is going to be looking at our ability to learn from experience, our ability to solve problems, and to use that knowledge to adapt to new situations. And what you're going to see through this lecture is there are a lot of different people who have attempted to try to figure out what exactly intelligence is, and there's just as many people who try to figure out, well, how are we going to assess it? So this is going to be another one of those lectures where names are important, and so we'll try to make sure that we keep them all straight. We're going to start today talking about a guy named Charles Spearman. Charles Spearman, he was actually a student of Wilhelm Wundt, if you remember talking about Wundt and kind of the father of psychology. And what Spearman did was Spearman was looking at people's abilities and found that basically if someone is skilled in one particular area, let's say they have a high vocabulary, they will also be skilled in very similar areas like reading comprehension. And so he used factor analysis, which we've discussed before in class, and looked for these correlations between abilities, and essentially claims that people have a general intelligence. In other words, we can try to quantify intelligence, give it one number, and depending on what that one number is, that is how intelligent you are. And so if you score well in one area, you will likely score well in many other areas. You can almost think of it as being an athlete. If someone is highly athletic, does that mean that they can run really fast or jump really high or they're very strong? General intelligence would make the argument that if someone is highly athletic, they're probably skilled in all of these different areas. And so you can use that perhaps as an analogy. In the 1980s, so this, Spearman's theory lasted for quite some time. In the 1980s, a guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, Howard Gardner, wrote a book called Frames of Mind. And in his book, he essentially points out all of these geniuses, but they're geniuses in different areas. And so he wrote about guys like Picasso and Beethoven. He wrote about Michael Jordan and Gandhi and Freud. And he argued that these people are geniuses, but they're geniuses in very different ways. And so he presents the idea of multiple intelligences. In his original book, Frames of Mind, there are 8 different intelligences, and you can kind of see them listed on this slide. Technically, these 8 intelligences are part of the curriculum. In my mind, taking the time to learn the 8 different intelligences is probably not worth your time. A lot of them are pretty straightforward. Linguistic, for example, Gardner wrote about Mark Twain and his ability to come up with these new novel ideas that perhaps people had not before. Musical intelligences, he wrote about Beethoven and his creative ability of putting pieces of music together. The two that sometimes trip people up are interpersonal and intrapersonal. With interpersonal, think your ability to understand others and the relationship with other people. The genius that Gardner wrote about in this case would be Gandhi, whereas intrapersonal, this is really understanding yourself and understanding within. And the example given for intrapersonal was Freud. Robert Sternberg, not too many years after Gardner came out with his multiple intelligences theory, came out with his own theory of intelligence. This is kind of the triarchic theory of intelligence. You might recognize that name, Robert Sternberg. He's the same guy who came up with the triangular theory of love, and so Sternberg kind of has a thing for threes, apparently. But the idea behind Sternberg essentially is if you look at these different multiple intelligences that Gardner writes about, a lot of them are pretty similar. You can put together, for example, guys like Beethoven and Picasso and Mark Twain, and perhaps say these guys all have a creative intelligence, the ability to generate these new ideas. If you look at someone like Einstein with these mathematical intelligences, this would be analytical. There is a well-defined problem. It's usually formulaic, and you can, come to that one single answer. And then if you look at Freud, if you look at Gandhi, our ability to solve real world problems in a very complex world, things that perhaps don't have one singular answer, how do we find world peace? How do we solve a hunger crisis? These are going to be your practical intelligences. One way to try to remember Sternberg, think he puts a cap on Gardner's multiple intelligences. So the CAP puts a cap on those 8 and narrows it down to 3. Once we have figured out kind of what intelligence is, then we need to figure out, well, how are we going to assess it? And so generally speaking, we have 2 different ways to assess intelligence. We have what are referred to as aptitude tests, and we have achievement tests. Aptitude tests attempt to predict how you will do in the future. So it looks at current skills you have and make predictions. For example, the ACT. The ACT is attempting to see how you will do in college, predict future success based off of skills that you currently have. An achievement test, on the other hand, is going to be a test that looks at prior knowledge that you've already gained. The AP Psych exam is not trying to predict how you'll do in the future. It's simply knowing or trying to figure out what do you already know. If you take a driving test, for example, you turn 16, it's time to get your license. The written portion of a driving exam would be considered achievement. You have to memorize different rules of the road and things that you need to follow while you're driving around. An aptitude test would be the actual getting behind the wheel and driving, where there's a licensed instructor who's with you and is looking at the skills that you possess to try to figure out how you will be driving in the future. We're going to rewind the clock back until right at the turn of the century, like early 1900s. And there was a guy named Alfred Binet, not Bennett, but Binet. And he was French, and he was hired essentially by the French government to try to come up with a test to figure out what is the IQ of all of these school-aged children. So as children are first starting to go off to school, they're trying to figure out who's going to need some extra assistance. And so Binet devised essentially a formula to try to put a number on people's intelligence. It was later adopted by a guy named Louis Terman, who brought it to the United States and revised the exam to be more appropriate for people in America. And it's what we now refer to as the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. The formula you can see kind of right here in the middle. And essentially IQ, according to Binet and Terman, would be when you take a person's mental age, the ability of problems that they can solve, and divide it by their chronological age, so how old they actually are. You multiply that by 100, and that gives you the IQ. So you may recall that we've discussed how IQ, the average IQ, is 100. It makes perfect sense. If you're 16 years old, right, that would be your chronological age, and you are an average 16-year-old, you would have the mental age of a 16-year-old. 16 divided by 16 is 1 times 100. That gives you your average IQ of 100. I have that question up here. If a student is 10 years old and has a mental age of 8, well, if you take that mental age of 8, divide it by 10, it gives you 0.8 times 100. That'd be an IQ of 80, which makes sense. 80 is going to be less than 100. Well, if you have a 10-year-old who has a mental age of 8, of course they're going to be below average. Whereas if you have someone who has a mental age of 12 and they're only 10 years old, well, you take that 12 divided by 10, that's 1.2 times 100. They're going to have an IQ of 120. So if average is 100 and you have a 10-year-old who's doing the calculations of a 12-year-old, of course they're going to be above average. The reality is we don't use this calculation anymore. There's some problems, some deficiencies within this calculation. What is the mental age of a 20-year-old? What is the mental age of a 30-year-old? And you can see how this calculation starts to fall apart as you get older and older. We currently, the most popular intelligence tests used today are the Wechsler exams. And there's essentially 2 main types. There's what we call the WAIS and the WISC. The Wechsler exam Essentially looks at these 4 different components that you have up here, and as you look at those and write those in your notes, just think whether or not you believe these actually deal with intelligence. For example, how important is it that you can solve a problem quickly? How important or how intelligent are you if you can put patterns together with this kind of perceptual organization? Many psychologists would argue that these elements of the Wechsler test give us a good indicator as to how intelligent you are. Again, your ability to solve problems, take information you know, and apply it to new situations. If we're designing an intelligence test, there are a few elements that are very important. First of all, tests have to be standardized. Essentially what that means is we have to norm the exam. We have to take the results of people who've had the exam before and compare it to new people taking the test. I have up here a kind of a bell curve that I've shown you before that goes through the standard deviations of intelligence. This is all review for you. The vast majority of people falling within 1 standard deviation is 68%, within 2 standard deviation is 95%, within 3 standard deviations is 99%. Furthermore, it's also important to recognize where those actual scores would be. So average IQ would be at 100, 1 standard deviation above intelligence would be a 115, 1 standard deviation below the average intelligence would be an 85, and you can kind of see where it goes from there. So it's not a horrible idea to pause the video here. Just make sure you look at this bell curve and kind of have an idea of what it's talking about. If any of it's confusing, obviously come see me or shoot me an email. The second thing when it comes to test construction is making sure the test itself is reliable. When we say reliable, think repeat. When you take the test again, will you get consistent results? I have some different elements of test reliability on the screen here. They're pretty straightforward, so I'll let you kind of pause and write those down, but I don't want to spend too much time going over those themselves. And the third and final thing that you want to make sure you understand is the idea of validity. So reliability and validity are not the same thing. Reliability, repeating with the same results. Validity, is it actually testing or measuring what it claims to measure? And we talk about this when we talk about research methods as well. But essentially, is the test going to measure what it says it's going to? The ACT claims to measure, for example, college readiness. One can make the argument that there are way too many factors that go into actually being ready for college, that the ACT, although reliable, perhaps is not incredibly valid. Fluid and crystallized intelligence. This is again something that was discussed by Spearman. The idea behind fluid and crystallized intelligence, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about development and we talked about aging, but the main difference here is essentially how are you capable of solving problems. Fluid intelligence is taking new incoming information and adapting to it and learning how to do something new. Whereas crystallized intelligence will look at a collection of information and wisdom that you have gained over time. I often give the comparison that your grandparents may know all of the answers to Jeopardy, but they don't know how to turn Jeopardy on using the remote control. Knowing the answers to Jeopardy, that's crystallized intelligence. Knowing how to use the new cable remote, that's a better example of fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence peaks. It usually peaks right around late teens, early 20s, and has a slow decline from there, whereas crystallized intelligence, for the most part, will continue as you age. One more time, looking at the bell curve of intelligence, you'll notice that we have these extremes. If we start getting several standard deviations above and below, we get into the highly gifted area, anything over 130, kind of the top 2%. And then intellectual disabilities would be an IQ under 70%. So that would be the bottom 2 percentile. When you get into intellectual disabilities, what we call cognitive impairment, this is what we used to refer to as mental retardation, and there's severe limitations obviously that go along with that. I'll let you pause this video here and just kind of digest everything that's going on within this one slide. But the gist of this slide is when we're trying to figure out what has a strong impact on intelligence, you can see the differences between identical and fraternal twins raised both together and apart. And at the end of the day, you'll find when you look at this graph that although environment certainly does have an impact on intelligence, intelligence is highly genetic. And that's an important thing to know. So that's going to do it for today. I went pretty quick at the end because I was running out of time with my video. As always, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to come see me or shoot me an email, and best of luck.